Welcome. In this episode, we are continuing our study of the motives of exploration. We left off last time and we're talking about the why did Europeans explore? As we looked at our two waves of imperialism, while the origins of a major European domination of the world does not happen exactly with first wave imperialism, that comes centered on the year 1900, where about 7 countries in the world ruled like 3/4 of the land and people of the whole world through their empires that they had conquered. And while this really happened in the late early 1900s, the seeds of it are somewhat sown in this 1500s and 1600s, when, again, the European nations were nothing to much write home about. But one of the sources of the growth of this domination is the fact that they so much desired to establish trade networks that they didn't have nice things that other people in the world had, and they wanted to trade for them. But by initiating and leading that global desire for trade and that globalization, it made many of their people and governments much wealthier and began to concentrate some wealth and make Europe a little bit stand out from other areas of the world because of controlling these trade networks that up to this point they had been entirely excluded from and were generally one of the world's average or poorer regions in some ways. So why is it that Europeans start on this path toward controlling a lot of the world's wealth and power? The key is economic, right? It is about money. It is about trade. They wanted that better route to the Indies, to India, to China, to Indonesia. They wanted a direct route to East and bypass all of those other people, the Italians and Arabs and Africans and Indian and Central Asians, all the people that are causing there to be more taxes and more security and more middleman markups that are doubling, tripling, quintupling, multiplying prices by 10 and 20, not out of any uh, hate or problem, but because it's going through all of those hands and over that long distance. And these Europeans, in order to get access to those goods, your spice, cotton, stone, sugar, silk, drugs, perfume, porcelain, in order to get these things, they are trying to establish that direct route. And they're going to try to bring things that they have that other people don't as much have. And, they're often not as interested, but they will trade and take some of the things if they have to in order to establish those trade relationships. So they're also seeking markets. They have stuff they hope others will buy. A key thing that helps them to prosper is shipping income. There becomes a market for building ships, repairing ships, crewing a ship. There are even kind of not very exciting things, but it's like the invention of insurance. Modern insurance can trace itself to the idea that many of these ships would sail away and never come back. And so you have the formation of joint stock companies, the forerunner of today's corporations. You have the forerunners of insurance companies. And so these really powerful things that we take for granted, such as capitalism, such as stock markets, such as stock companies, stock jointly held companies, such as insurance. These have their origins in Europeans trying to solve this problem of getting stuff they wanted without paying as much for it. And these are critical things that we take for granted in the modern world that are invented in order to solve those problems. They want those exotic goods for import. We already talked about it. I have in quotes the cheap land in the New World. There eventually is this desire to find new land, but that really comes later, right? They sort of the New World, the Americas, are quote unquote discovered on accident, and the land is so-called cheap because partly of conquest, but mainly because the indigenous people die, and there is widely available land that many Europeans want to conquer and have access to. And so versus many other parts of the world were filled up. And the Americas were largely filled up and heavily densely populated by the indigenous people who lived there. But as they died, Europeans took advantage of that situation. And so it was comparatively, and sarcastically in quotes, that land was cheap by their standards because it was easy to conquer compared to any other place in the world. at that point. Why else did they explore? Well, they're rivals. Why do sport teams play? Why do high schools compete? They were rivals. If Portugal explores, Spain wants to keep up, and France and England, the Netherlands, and those are the 5 big early explorers. They want to keep up with each other. They are competitive rivals. Why do they explore? They had strong national governments. They can marshal vast resources. They had efficient bureaucracies that could collect taxes and borrow money when they needed to. This was an age of fervent religious spirit. They had a missionary spirit to drive to save souls. And as the early imperializers were often Catholic, there was this idea that so many people were leaving the Catholic Church and becoming Protestant in Europe at this time, that there were many missionaries who found that Native Americans and people in other parts of the world had never heard the gospel message and had never heard of Jesus, and they very much wanted to convert people in other parts of the world to sort of, quote, make up for losses to the Protestants. And so there were a lot of especially Catholic missionaries. There would also, as other countries explored, be Protestant Christian missionaries as well. There wasn't exactly overpopulation, but there is some population pressure. There was a lot of religious persecution. Remember, it was really not the case that people of different religions lived in the same community, and your only options were to be closeted about it, to maybe suffer persecution, maybe change your religion, or to leave. And so many people wanted other parts of the world to go explore or live in, and so there was persecution that pushed people out of Europe. You really couldn't get land. Land had to be inherited. And versus there was this ability to obtain by conquest and sometimes by trade in other parts of the world, this so-called cheap land. There's very little social mobility, but if you move to a new part of the world, you can move up and be a landowner and be not exactly a nobleman, but a higher social status person in another part of the world. And there are those who actually thought maybe you could have a better diet. This is a debated question among historians. Now, a motive for exploration is not that they were seeking new technology, but they did have a few new technologies that were not new to the whole world. Other people had been doing this, but they kind of hit a perfect storm as they had improved some navigation tools and were better able to chart by the stars. An interesting development in Portugal was a type of ship called the caravel, which its unique feature, get this, is a sailboat that can sail against the wind. Right? The wind is blowing west and you can sail east. How's that work? Well, they cheat a little bit. It's that they zigzag. You can use the sails at different angles to funnel the wind, and you can't literally make an east blowing wind push you west, but you can make a mostly eastern blowing wind push you a little bit southwest and then a little bit northwest. And if you keep kind of zigzagging using the wind, you can, like, you can't move with no wind, but you can actually kind of move against the wind with this new type of sailboat. So that was a big deal. You could now safely sail across the oceans. Other peoples had gone across the oceans other times. They think the Vikings, African Phoenicians, the Micronesians in Indonesia. People had crossed oceans before, but on a big scale and reliably, this is kind of a new big deal to be able to do this on a large scale and repeatably in this time period. They also had gunpowder, which again, like the printing press, was imported from China, but so they have muskets. But gunpowder hand weapons are actually not that impressive. They're not very accurate. For a long time, crossbows and swords and just mounted knights were still quite good. A little more devastating were cannons that could bring down castle walls and pound away at enemy ships and were much more intimidating as weapons on the battlefield. So small cannons were making a big impact. And a question here, why not Italy? Why not the Holy Roman Empire? These are countries that we've spoken about with the Italian Renaissance, that we've talked about in the Reformation period and others. Why are they left out? Well, in Italy's case, they have a bunch of small city-states, and they don't want new methods of exploration. They dominated the old way. The Italians were making bank on this method of trade. Secondly, the Italians the type of shipping they're in is suitable for the Mediterranean, which has much smaller storms. It's much harder to get lost. The new larger caravels and ships that could cross the open ocean are a different type of ship. And so the Italians are not going to change on a dime what type of shipping they're doing when they're already making bank doing the type of trade that they're really good at. Additionally, it's a little bit like Kodak film or Blockbuster video. When you're really good at something, it's hard to look at the next innovation. Kodak invented digital photography over a decade before digital photography went mainstream, but they didn't really push people to use digital photography because what Kodak made most of its money on was selling film that went into cameras. And so they ultimately kind of lost out and virtually went away. Same with Blockbuster Video. They had the opportunity to buy Netflix for $1 million early in Netflix's career, and they were like, ha, that's going to fail. And they stuck it out being a local video store, and now Blockbuster is gone, and Netflix is huge. So when you're already dominating a type of trade, it can be really hard, really easy to get stuck in your ways and hard to be the innovator. So the Italians are kind of stuck. The Holy Roman Empire, even though they were rich and powerful, the Holy Roman Empire was divided. Cuius regio, eius religio. They've got religious war, they've got lots of factions, and so they don't have a single ruler that speaks for them all and runs the empire like one country. They've got a bunch of small competing dukes and princes, and so they are going to struggle to put these huge, expensive endeavors together. It's going to be nation states or proto-nation states like the Portuguese, the Spanish, soon the French, the British, the Dutch, who can afford and put together these things. Lastly, a quick review of some of the real famous early imperializers, the early American, European explorers. Prince Henry the Navigator, he doesn't exactly open a school, but he makes it known that Portugal, he's a prince in Portugal, that Portugal wants to do this. They develop the caravel, and they largely send these expeditions to settle the Azores and explore down the coast of Africa and set up trading posts and to trade relationships with people further and further away. The next big Portuguese explorer is Bartholomew Diaz, who is able to round the Cape of Good Hope, which up to that point they called the Cape of Storms, and return successfully back to Portugal. They're looking for this direct route to India. They know it exists. They know where it is. It's really hard to sail that far and back. They don't have refrigeration. They need to keep taking on food, keep taking on water. All kinds of mean, ugly, nasty things can happen. And so they've got to establish friendly relations with all of the people on the way and keep stopping to refuel and resupply. They make it past the Cape of Good Hope and return successfully. His successor, the guy that comes immediately after him, is Vasco da Gama, who in 1498, that's actually after Columbus, take note. Columbus is 1492. Da Gama is able to make it around Africa all the way to India and back and establish a trade relationship with India. And he is able to discover that, yes, he can make 20 times more profit by successfully making it to India oneself rather than paying the taxes and protection and middlemen of sending supplies by land or through all these middlemen. And so Da Gama offers proof of concept, and the Portuguese make bank off of this. But the Spanish are in direct competition, and Columbus will sail from Spain. And since the Portuguese have a head start and maybe have allies in Africa that would be against the Spanish decide they're going to try to sail to the west in order to get to the east. And when he lands on Hispaniola in the Caribbean, he thinks that maybe it's the Philippines or Japan or Indonesia, which is why that area is often called the Indies, the West Indies, and Indians are called Indians by accident. The name kind of stuck because they thought they were in Indonesia or India, and that was Columbus's thing. We'll talk much more about Columbus later in the unit. Amerigo Vespucci was another explorer, and the name stuck. His name, Amerigo, is applied to the Americas. And finally, Ferdinand Magellan, the Spaniard who circumnavigated the world, and they went through the Straits of Magellan below South America and he actually died in the Philippines, but his first mate made it all the way back to Spain over the course of about 3 years as they circumnavigated the world.